Welcome, everybody, to the Great Unconstitutional. I want to thank everybody for that are coming on board. We have a great lineup for you today, and we're going to get started really soon. We have Dr. Robert Nelson and Leah Rothstein here, and they're going to we're going to have a great conversation about redlining, the cultural ramifications, and just how the global, the national look at how redlining was such a widespread and urban renewal that happened afterwards, how that affected the many communities across the United States of America. All right. So let's get to it. So first of all, happy Black History Month. I want to thank everybody that has been supporting our campaign, the Boston Redline 85 campaign. This is our way of marking the 85th anniversary of the Boston Red Line map. The Boston Red Line map was issued February 1st, 1938. Yesterday, we marked an infamous day indeed. That issuing of the Boston Red Line map started a process that lasted many years, and we'll go through that shortly. All right. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm the president of the Afrimerican Culture Initiative. I will be facilitating, along with my partner in Kiru, today's event. The Afrimerican Culture Initiative is a Boston-based nonprofit organization with the mission to build cultural bridges in African diaspora through education, technology, and travel. We specialize in restorative project management and cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion. We design, engineer, and maintain systems that build community, repair harm, and promote inclusivity in underserved multicultural communities in Boston. Our number one project is the Afrimerican Academy, which is an after-school summer program, educational and employment program designed to nurture the culture to thrive in multicultural youth in Boston from 15 to 23 years old. When they work for us, they work for our Afrimerican TV, and they do a lot of research and development on these slides. We organize field trips. We go out, and these young people are now writing the histories, the segregated histories, the Green Book histories that exist in their community. So we're very excited about Leah and Dr. Nelson helping us, to raise awareness as well as providing more content so that our young people can learn about what happened in their communities. This is the team that we have today. Working with us, we have two students from the Boston Public School System. Kamara just was with our summer program, and she graduated. She's at UMass Dartmouth. Brianna, she's currently still in school, and they're working with us virtually. We also have a Northeastern research team. We got a new set of students. These students were actually from last semester, but they did the foundational work on what we're doing. And so this is the team that does the research and everything to get some of this information out, right? We're going to be having 5 questions at the end of this presentation. So please, I would like all of you, if you're watching, if you want to be eligible for it, we're giving away a $50 Uber Eats ride voucher. So if you participate in today's event, the top score on the quiz, only 5 questions, easy questions, really is how fast you can do it. So we urge you to get 2 devices, go get on your phone, and then watch it on the screen. Go to YouTube and participate in the slides as we go. We'll be doing that a little later. But for now, I want you to meet our panelists. Inkiru, would you please, could you introduce our panelists for us?
Yes, so we just wanted to thank you all once again for tuning in to the special presentation. And we want to give a very special thank you to our panelists who are joining us here tonight. We have with us Dr. Rob Nelson, as well as Ms. Leah Rothstein. And I'll just briefly go over their introductions, and then they will go in and tell us a little bit more about themselves as we go on tonight. So we have, let me just pull that up here. Robert K. Nelson is a director of the Digital Scholarship Lab and head of digital engagement in Boatwright Library. He is the editor of American Panorama, an atlas of United States history, which includes mapping inequality, redlining in New Deal America. American Panorama received the 2019 Royal Rosenzweig, I do apologize if I'm saying it incorrectly, Prize for Innovation in Digital History from the American Historical Association and was named the Tech Innovation by the Chronicle of Higher Education's in 2016. Mapping Inequality received honorable mention for the 2019 Garfinkel Prize from the American Studies Association's Digital Humanities Caucus. Other digital history projects that Nelson has developed include Mining the Dispatch and a remediated, enhanced version of Charles Paulin's 1932 Atlas of the Historical Geography of the United States. Nelson teaches courses related to anti-slavery and slavery in the United States and about the digital humanities. So thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. And also for Leah Rothstein, she's a co-author with Richard Rothstein of Just Action, a sequel to The Color of Law. While in The Color of Law, Mr. Rothstein described how government policy created residential segregation. Just Action describes how local community groups can begin to redress the wrongs of segregation. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She has led the Alameda and the San Francisco probation department's research on reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehab, not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a labor and community organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and education. So once again, we just want to thank you to our thank you to our panelists, and then we'll allow them to introduce themselves a little bit more.
Go ahead, Dr. Nelson.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from Leah. So I'm gonna give you I'm going to be trying to be brief as I can manage. I'm not always brief, especially when I start talking about this history, which is really, really interesting and really important. So what I'm going to try and do is provide like a really brief and concise introduction to a couple of 20th century government programs in housing and urban policy. I'm going to talk when I'm introducing that about how these programs were, in one case, explicitly racist, and in the other case, well, often that, and often kind of racist in their, or had racist effects in its implementation, and had a massive negative impact on communities of color across the United States. And then finally, I want to just kind of hint at how these policies from 80 years ago, from a half century ago, continue to impact us today, and look at some of the associations between these policies and how they were implemented, spatially, and some of the inequalities we see in American cities in 2023. So I'm going to start by talking about redlining in the 1930s, and if you wouldn't mind showing that.
Dr. Nelson, Dr.
Yeah.
Nelson, we're just doing the introductions now. And then we'll get to the talking. Sorry.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. Just introduce yourself, and then I'm gonna, like I said,
I'm Rob.
Right. Sorry. Go ahead, Ms. Leah.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Leah. Nkiru gave a great intro to me, so I think you know everything you need to know about me, but I'm really happy to be here and excited to hear what Dr. Nelson is going to present. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. A lot of people, the work that we do at the Afrimerican Academy is really to provide cultural supports for our, for our community in light of the urban renewal. And I don't think people really kind of grasp that the indigenous African American community, meaning those that have been here since the beginning of our country, that they have special cultural issues that were being served by the physical spaces in these communities. So while it's a lot of communities faced some of the same thing because of the cultural fragility of the indigenous African American community, this impact was devastating to the cultural development, because the physical spaces that they had, the memories that they had, everything that they had developed since 1865 was taken away in the 60s. And so I always try to point out that this is, before the zip code, things like that. So we'll get into the video, and then it's a bit long, but I feel like it lays a good, it's about 6 minutes, but it lays a good foundation for what we're going to talk about. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. I'm pressing
I walked through the middle of the block, and I looked at both sides of the street. It was gone. And I didn't want to break down in the street and cry because it was gone. The history was gone.
They got the people out. Then they tore the whole thing down and built expensive housing.
In the 1950s and 60s, the federal government forced 300,000 families from their homes.
The human tragedy is incalculable.
This is the story of the destruction and survival of one community. Philip Payton Jr. wanted to end residential segregation in New York City.
Payton was the premier black realtor of the day.
In 1905, he began buying and leasing buildings on West 99th and 98th Streets, two all-white blocks on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Then he rented apartments to blacks.
Blacks were saying, why shouldn't they have the opportunity to rent there in this aristocratic part of the city?
West 99th and 98th Streets between Columbus Avenue and Central Park West became home to a community of musicians and writers. Arturo Schomburg lived on 99th Street along with James Weldon Johnson and Billie Holiday.
When Billie Holiday came in town, everybody was, just to see her come in, with her glamorous self, and if she was in show business,
Many families stayed on West 99th and 98th Streets for generations.
My grandfather came from South Carolina to 99th Street. I was born there in 99th Street, so that's all we ever knew was 99th Street.
I started thinking about 99th Street and trying to see how many people that I remembered that lived in those houses. My parents were married in 29 West 99th Street, February 5th, 1914.
There were eyes watching you. You could go down the street and you could count on my Aunt Dee being in her top floor window, looking out the window.
I better not do nothing. And by the time I got home, my mother knew about it because somebody done told my mother.
I really believe anybody that lived in West 99th and West 98th Street loved it. And when we had to move, we were just devastated.
In 1949, President Truman signed the National Housing Act, creating a federal program called Urban Renewal.
This vast, unprecedented federal housing program gave cities the power of eminent domain. Substantial areas of the city were taken from the owner.
The goal was to replace chaotic old neighborhoods with planned communities.
What was once a run-down, dying section of the great city of New York has been recreated.
Talk to people about urban renewal. Oh, what a great thing we're doing for the poor people.
The slum means disease and crime. The new projects mean health and happiness.
West 99th and 98th Streets were declared a slum in 1951, and everyone living there was told they'd have to leave.
There are definitions of slums, the income level of the families. But while these people were poor, that didn't mean that they had a bad life, as long as they had their neighborhood.
Everybody was aiming for the same thing. Everybody wanted to finish school, get a good job, help support your parents, get married, have a family. It was togetherness that I cannot explain to you any more better than what I'm doing.
At 13, I'm looking forward to all these things that my older siblings had experienced. And we had to move. There is a space in my life right now that's missing because of that move.
The new housing was to be built not by the government, but by private companies handpicked by the city.
For the first time in history, the city could condemn a piece of property and turn it over to a private individual.
Robert Moses, who was head of New York's Slum Clearance Committee, had the power to pick and choose which companies got the condemned land.
They would take over these large chunks of its incredibly valuable real estate. Imagine real estate in Manhattan.
He gave it out as political favors to his allies in the Democratic Party.
All of the contracts came through the political clubs. They gave them to their friends who were builders or realtors or phony corporations.
West 99th and 98th Streets and 4 surrounding blocks were sold for a token sum to a group of local Democratic Party apparatchiks. 5 years later, the original buildings were only partially torn down.
There might have been a couple of houses people were still living in. There were some diehards, they wouldn't move.
We had no heat, no hot water. We still stayed till it became an emergency and they had to get us out of there.
Why did you keep staying?
That was our home. I couldn't understand why they wanted to tear my home down. It was not a slum.
I tell people I never left the old neighborhood. That is my village. That's my village. When I was young, it was painful.
My man. Okay.
And I got past that, and I think most of us did, by remembering what was good. And the older I get, the stronger that feeling gets.
I feel pretty sad when I go by now. So many memories.
And they said it would last. That's right.
We laugh about it, but yet it's a sad feeling. I feel that something was just taken away from us.
All right. So that video, I think, like I said, lays a lot of foundation of how people did not see those places as slums. Those places were homes, and they were vibrant communities. And yes, like especially when you consider the cultural background of the African American community, they were, they had just received civil rights. So some redline facts I want to go through real quick. Well, it really marks the beginning of the industrialization of America, right? Because at this time when the red maps were done, it was all like, farmland, and there were no highways and things like that. Redline primarily identified indigenous African American communities, but also removed other multicultural hubs, generally the allies, people who believed in multiculturalism. A little reference is that the redline maps were drawn like 25 years before the zip code. Zip code was instituted in 1961, right before the urban renewal. 60% of the Boston indigenous African American cultural hub. So like when I say cultural hub, I'm talking about like a Chinatown, like a place of soul food restaurants and vibrant tailors and people that had homes and rented out their homes like Airbnb. All these businesses were tied into their infrastructure in their homes, and they were taken. So all what the indigenous African American community had achieved from slavery till 1965 or so was taken away in one fell swoop. Right now, there's a 33-year life expectancy difference between Roxbury and Back Bay. Roxbury is the area that I primarily study because it's called Nubian Square now. Nubian Square is, the first aberration on the Boston map ever that shows African American cultural rights as far as land. Like this, we've lived here long enough, and we're from this area. This is the center of our community. And even though a lot of the area has been, a lot of the things have been taken out, they still named it Nubian Square, right? So our Black History Month is to honor our ancestors that were in this situation, they had to face the urban renewal and the red line, and which was the effect of redlining, and celebrate the cultural diversity of Boston. Because one of the issues that even with during desegregation was that Boston had a harder time because it wasn't just a white versus black scenario. It was Irish and Polish, Lithuanian, Syrian. I looked at the Boston Red Line map. There's Jewish. There's of course, indigenous African Americans, Italians, right? So this is about multiculturalism, but yes, primarily about race. So what is a cultural hub, right? And what is cultural diversity? The existence of a variety of cultural ethnic groups within a society. So that society to me puts land bounds. I'm more interested I'm a civil engineer, and our studies really have to do with the land use and the spaces and what those spaces were used for, because we believe that these spaces represent the height of African American culture in the country. And as a result, these are the roadmap to what we had decided to build, right? The way we wanted to build it around our cultural strengths of music, soul food, things like that. That is what these communities did. And that is why it is important that we look at that when we're trying to build back. This slide, I try to talk about the relationship between culture, land, and law. And basically, once you have a safe space and you're in a safe environment, human beings start developing their culture. There was a great explosion of culture after slavery, from blues to jazz. It goes on and on with rock and roll, gospel. It goes R&B, rap, hip hop, a huge cultural explosion. And I always ask people, how did Aretha Franklin, right, become a great musician? Because you already know that like the music schools like Berkeley or all the prestigious music, they're not accepting Black people. So how do we get all these great musicians? It's because there was a network of churches and clubs that gave safe spaces to our community to practice their culture. A lot of countries also have slavery, but because there was safe space land, we're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Haiti, we're talking about Jamaica, and these places, they were able to have safe spaces in order to develop that culture. And in the 60s, there was a church, there was a network of churches that was producing musicians and everything all across the country. I always like this map, Dr. Nelson, because when you don't put it in, when you don't put in your where your city is from, where you want to go, it just shows you the whole thing. I thought that was brilliant, because there's nothing that says how global this problem is seeing this picture right here. I have a picture of the Green Book, which is the Negro Motorist book, usually used because there was this Black economy that was growing across America, right? Black exploitation movies, entertainment, in only Black areas. So this book was needed to navigate so you could find safe spaces when you travel across the United States during segregation. So this book, there's a lot of history that is untold in this book. That's why when we say we are writing, we get our young people to write these little local histories. These local histories represent what was not out there, which is only our story, and only we can determine that story. So that the relationship between culture, land, and law means that when people live on a piece of land for a long enough time, they gain attachment to it. They develop their culture on it, and then if you now put a border that's artificial within that cultural space, you end up dividing them, because they have to now observe different laws, right? Because laws determine behavior. If you're in some parts of the country, you can do certain things. If you're in other parts of the city, you can do other things. All right. But for the most part, you're not able to communities suffer when they're divided culturally. And that's what this is. So this is there are like three major groups in Boston. There's the that were affected. The Italians were affected in the north. This is the north end. This is the west end. There was a deal. So the north end is actually still existing, while the west end was leveled and now is high-rise apartments and things like that. But these two actually, there's something that's actually very interesting, because the overall thing is that these places were slums, and that was why they needed to be torn down. But when you now look and see that the existing north end is still there and the buildings are still standing very strong, then you know that obviously there was nothing wrong with the buildings, because all these buildings were built the same. The next group was the African Americans. There's Irish and there's other groups. There's Syrian. There's other groups that were affected, but the major damages were done in these communities. This is where Slades and Bill Russell are located. There's like one other place, Wally's Jazz. A lot of the churches there are all gone. And then the last group, and this is what I call yellow lining, which I believe is really because of the political and economic status of the Jewish community in this area. They would be able to fight back, is what I kind of rest my mind on. Because they were making the same amount of money as the people that lived in the blue areas and the yellow areas. But so because of this, the different tactics, which included busting, price manipulation of the housing, and then also other kinds of financial exploitations, as well as infrastructure issues in Boston, and the fact that most of the communities that got affected did not have a problem with mixing with people of color. They provided jobs and things like that. So the Jewish community was an ally to the Black community in general during this time. And 68,000 Jews as late as the 1960s were in this community, and they are no longer there. It's only communities of color now. All right. So let me go through this. And finally, this is the Boston, not finally, but this is the Dudley Street Baptist Church. It was the flagship of right across from Dudley Station. Anybody knows Boston knows Dudley Station has been the primary entry point into the main Boston since the beginning of Boston, since the 1700s. So moving the Orange Line, which was this raised thing away from here, basically affected primarily the African American community and the Jewish community. And I believe the final death nail in making the Jewish community downstream from this church go. There's a special issue now because there's a library on this land. Literally, this is an old picture of 2018. There's actually a library right next to where this church once stood, and that library has no mention of the church. And this takes me to this is why there's cultural rights and civil rights. Civil rights are technical, sort of like a technical marriage where you get married, right? But you just go to court, you sign a piece of paper, right? There's nothing there, but just a technical, and it's important. I don't want to be like I'm poo-pooing on civil rights. No, civil rights are great, but civil rights are not culturally directed. So when you now put the library there, kids are not engaged because the same spaces that existed in this church, as far as cooking, books, opportunities to public speak, all those different cultural practices that we had, these safe spaces. These cultural practices mean that when you take away the music practicing space that was inherent in this building, right? When you do that for 2 generations, this generation cannot play instruments. So you're talking about 2 generations ago, you had the greatest musicians of all time in the same community. This area was full of jazz clubs and all kinds of soul food restaurants. Remember, there were kitchens there. This is how you practice. You cook with people, you cook with the elders, they teach you the recipe, and then you go down and it continues on and on. So for the African American community that already was culturally challenged, we're the only people in the world, in the entire world, that do not have a library of names in which to choose to name our children. We have to create our names. We're the only people that don't have the cultural diversity of food that has vegetables and everything in it. Right? We have just the food that we have. We're the ones that don't have our language. There's no cultural land. It goes on and on. So when you look at, okay, well, the Jamaican was also, Jamaicans were also enslaved people at one point, right? But they had land, so they have food, they have culture, they have a way of talking, they have all these cultural identity things because they have the whole island to practice. So this is the major issue with the culture, is that these spaces are not just spaces. They are places in which people practice their culture and transfer it to the next generation. All right, this is Ben Crump. This, in Florida, there's a real big issue going on where there's still attack on the culture. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the North and South, because the South is always more, expressive with how they feel, while the North, they just forget. And I think that's, it's just, it's different mentalities. But listen to what he has to say, and I think it'll bring it home.
Governor DeSantis, are you really trying to lead us into an era akin to communism that provides censorship of free thoughts? Or are we going to make sure that Governor DeSantis understands that we will stand on the American principles of the free exchange of ideas, whether those are ideals and culture of European history, whether those are ideals and culture of German history, whether those are ideals and culture of Japanese history, whether those are ideals and culture of Brazilian, Canadian, everybody who is here in America. You have a right to have your culture, your history respected and taught to the children of America.
So cultural rights is the next level, I believe, of civil rights, where it's not just enough to say we've given you a library. The library needs to be culturally directed with information about that local community, and so that our youth will be able to have people to live up to, people to espouse to know that we actually did things. We actually accomplished things, but those things were taken away. So that's why we don't have this history, or you don't have these other things in your communities. Not because we didn't achieve them as a people. That history is lost. There are people that don't even know that church, real historians that do not know that church ever existed. And it's only because we deal with maps and things like that that we're able to show them that this church existed. All right, so just a little bit about the multiculturalness of what we're doing. This is the West End. This was an Italian community predominantly. However, it was micro-segregated, where you had pockets of African-American culture, Polish culture, Jewish culture, all mixed in. And you can see here, this patch of land was taken away and used by the government and the city of Boston during the urban renewal. So this happened to communities, not just Black communities. I want to be very clear. It did not just happen to Black communities. And this is a very important thing, because multiculturalism and cultural diversity is what we're all about. And if we don't start showing that we share some of these issues, I think these provide the pathways to understanding that we need in our communities. And lastly, this is some Jewish temples that are now in communities of color, occupied by Haitian churches and other churches, right? There was a redline sprawl, so a lot of the places where the Jewish community was is now by African diaspora, meaning people from Jamaica, people that the indigenous African Americans live upstream, close to where the urban renewal happened. And then the African diaspora, Haitians, people like that, those Black immigrants moved in to these communities And we feel that this is a way to get pathways to understanding as well. All right. I think we are done with my bit. I hope I didn't go too long. Oh yeah. All right. So please, we're about to hear from our panelists. So we'd like you to please sign up on the Slido, right? Leah, please, and everybody, you guys are welcome to sign up as well. When they talk, we want you to write down the keywords that they say, so that we can have some data points on the things we need to work on as far as our curriculum development. All right. So, all right. If everybody will let people sign in to the Slido, and then we'll get started with Dr. Nelson giving us a discussion and a presentation. So while he's doing that, please. All right, no problem. No problem, Inkiru. All right. All right, so let's go to the next. All right. All right. Oh, sorry. Well, Miss Leah, if you want to go ahead.
Okay. You'd like me to go first? Sure.
Yeah, well, I changed the slide, but I obviously didn't click. So go ahead. It's fine.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. And I wanted to start my talk with talking about the concept of de facto segregation. This is a word many of us may have heard. We often use the term de facto segregation to explain why our communities are racially segregated. We acknowledge that schools, restaurants, public transportation, many other areas of life in the South were racially segregated by law, but we say that residential segregation is something totally different. It occurred not because of laws or policy, but naturally or by accident. This de facto explanation of segregation says that racial separation happened because private landlords and realtors and private businesses like banks and insurance companies, but not government, refused to make housing available to Black families in white neighborhoods. Or it happened because people just like to live with others of the same race, that we feel more comfortable that way. And while many of us look around at our segregated neighborhoods and we think it's too bad that it turned out this way, we don't feel like there's much we can do about it. We think whatever happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. The Supreme Court has endorsed this idea. Chief Justice John Roberts has argued that if the government didn't cause residential segregation, the Constitution prohibits the government from enacting policies that are explicitly designed to undo it. Well, in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, published a book called The Color of Law. It called De Facto Segregation, a Myth. Of course, he said, private actions created residential segregation, actions of realtors and banks and landlords. But those private actions were required and incentivized by government policies at all levels. Federal, state, local governments were so deeply involved in preventing Blacks and whites from living near one another that our residential segregation, which is the result of public policy, is as unconstitutional and as much a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments as the segregation of schools, restaurants, public transportation in the South. He also argued in Color of Law that if our residential segregation is unconstitutional, then we, all of us as Americans, as residents here, have an obligation to remedy it. But no one has stepped up to this obligation. So we've heard some about urban renewal. We'll hear more about redlining from Dr. Nelson soon, but I'll give you another example of how the government created the apartheid neighborhood system with which we live today. So after World War II, millions of war veterans returned home from the war. They started families, created the baby boom. Those families needed housing, but there was a housing shortage. Very little housing had been built in the Great Depression prior to World War II. And during the war, it was actually illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes, like building houses for people. So after the war, the federal government wanted to address this problem, and it embarked on a program to suburbanize the country, but for whites only. At the time, few people lived in suburbs. There weren't many suburbs, and people worked in factories that were located in downtown areas and city centers. They worked in industries that serviced those factories, which were also located in urban centers. They had to be near rail lines and ports that the industries needed to transport their goods. We didn't have the transportation and highway system we have now, so people had to live closer to where they worked. But the government wanted to move white working class families out of cities and create housing for them and for those white returning war veterans in suburbs outside of the cities. And African Americans living in cities or returning from the war were prohibited from benefiting from this government program. The most well-known of these government subsidized suburban developments is Levittown. It's east of New York City. The developer of Levittown, named William Levitt, he decided he wanted to build 17,000 homes for workers in New York City. He, of course, didn't have the money himself to finance 17,000 homes. He couldn't get a bank loan. This was purely speculative. Few people lived in suburbs at the time. He had no buyers yet. Building 17,000 homes is no small cost. So he didn't have the money. He couldn't get a bank to lend him the money. The only way he could build Levittown was with bank guarantees that were provided by the federal government through the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations. Those federal government departments required that on the condition for him to get this federally backed loan was that he only sell the homes he built to whites. This was a racially explicit federal program. This was no accident. This was no purely choice or private action. The manual of the Federal Housing Administration, the agency that subsidized Levitt and builders like him all across the country at the time, it explicitly prohibited giving bank loan guarantees for the construction of projects that were not all white. And it went so far as to say that there could be no federal guarantees for all white projects that were even located near where African Americans lived, because in the words of the manual, and I quote, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. So this notion of de facto segregation is nonsense. Suburbs around the country were segregated as explicitly and as unconstitutionally by the government as Levittown was. Now, it's true that William Levitt and many builders like him were bigots. Left to his own devices, Levitt would not have sold his homes to African American families, and he said as much at the time. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. If the Federal Housing Administration had followed its constitutional responsibilities and said to Levitt, look, we'll guarantee your bank loans, but only if you sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis. Well, he would have had no other alternative, and Levittown would be an integrated community today. But instead, it is now only 2% African American in an area that's about 13% Black. That's a direct result of the government program that helped create that suburb. Now, the homes in these suburbs like Levittown were inexpensive at the time. In the late 40s and early 50s, they cost about $100,000 in today's money. It was easily affordable to working class families, Black and white. Veterans needed no down payment. They would get Veterans Administration loans. But today, as we know, these suburban homes no longer sell for $100,000. They've appreciated in value. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who bought these homes with federal subsidies gained over the next couple of generations wealth from this increase in value, the equity that they built on these appreciating homes. They used that wealth to send their kids to college. They could take care of medical emergencies or maybe bouts of unemployment. They could enjoy their retirements. And most importantly, they could leave wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. Meanwhile, African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from purchasing the homes that would have led to the accumulation of similar wealth. The result is that today, while African American family incomes are about 60% of white incomes, African American household wealth is only about 5% of white household wealth. That's an enormous disparity. It's due almost entirely to the unconstitutional federal policy that has never been remedied and that none of us have stepped up to our responsibility to remedy. The wealth gap bears a big responsibility for the racial inequality we have in this country today, not only in housing, but in every aspect of our lives. There were many, many other federal, state, local policies in the 20th century that created our segregation. These policies were so powerful, they still determine our racial boundaries today. In 1968, we adopted a Fair Housing Act that prohibited future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And that's great. But preventing the future discrimination does not provide African Americans with the inherited wealth that they would possess were it not for the unconstitutional exclusion by the government from 20th century suburbanization. Working and middle-class families of either race can no longer afford to purchase most suburban homes unless they have that inherited wealth. Well, the color of law became very influential, and the myth of de facto segregation no longer has the currency it did before that book was published. And that's important, that's great. But knowing the history is not enough. Many readers of the book and people who attended his lectures about them, myself included, said it's great that we now know this history, but what do we do about it now? Well, to answer that question, I teamed up with my dad to write a new book, a sequel called Just Action. It will be released in June. And Just Action describes what local citizens and residents can do in their own communities to begin the process of redressing segregation. We don't believe that there's the political will today for the massive investments and interventions needed at a national level to accomplish this, but we do believe that there's a lot that can be done at the local level to create the beginnings of a movement that can eventually lead to the non-segregated society that we all deserve. But in order to get there, we need to build a new activist civil rights movement that takes on residential segregation. To do this, we can start by forming biracial, multi-ethnic groups to press for the redress of segregation in our communities. This itself may sound daunting to many people. In general, these days, outside of our workplaces, we have little contact with people of different races. This is in large part because we live in segregated neighborhoods. So it might be challenging to create biracial committees, but it's not impossible. In Just Action, we give a few examples of how biracial groups can get started. And once formed, these local committees can start by learning how we became so segregated as a country and how their own city segregated. Many communities have started this process, and we highlight a few where residents started to learn about their community segregation by discovering racially restrictive clauses on their own home's deeds. These restrictive covenants, as they're known, they were a primary tool of segregation in the early 20th century. They often required, like I explained earlier, they were required by the government in order to receive federally backed loans to build housing. And what these covenants do is they're written into the deed of a home, and they specify that that home or property can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Now, these covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they will always remain on the deeds of the homes. It's a legal document that can't be changed. So learning about this history, people in communities we've talked to have discovered that these covenants on the deeds of their homes, and they started investigating how prevalent those covenants were in their communities. They've created maps, they've talked to neighbors, they've educated each other, inventoried the racial covenants, and it's all raised their community's awareness, and it can inspire people to action. Because once we recognize that the segregation we've come to accept was created intentionally through these explicitly racially motivated actions by the government and industry, we can begin to intentionally challenge it. We can begin to understand that it was no accident, that it took intentional effort to create, and it'll take intentional effort to undo. So our book, Just Action, covers many policies and programs that these committees, once they're formed, can focus on. They're two-pronged, the strategies we talk about. They include remedies that are aimed at challenging segregation going forward, so we don't continue to create segregated communities, as well as ones that right the wrongs of the past. Because as I explained with the wealth gap, we can't just open up all communities to all races and expect everyone to have equal access to those communities without addressing the disparities created by past government action. So we need both these forward and past-focused efforts. Now we group the strategies we discuss for redress into two main categories. The first category includes approaches that aim to improve resources in existing lower-income African-American neighborhoods, where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government-sponsored segregation. Included in this category are strategies that address gentrification and attempt to keep Black and Hispanic residents from being displaced from their communities just as resources start improving and their areas become more desirable and expensive, and they are threatened of being priced out. These are anti-displacement strategies. They include protections for renters, to control rising rents and prevent unjust evictions, as well as strategies like inclusionary zoning, which require that new housing being built in gentrifying communities include units that are affordable to lower and moderate income families. Another strategy for improving resources in lower income segregated communities is starting or expanding a land trust. There are land trusts in over 200 communities around the country. I think Boston has one, but I'm not entirely sure. But when a land trust operates in an area with rising housing costs, it can create housing that remains permanently affordable, while the homes around it become more and more expensive and price current residents out of their community. A land trust also creates home ownership and wealth accumulation opportunities for lower and moderate income families in those neighborhoods. These are two huge goals to accomplish. So how does a land trust do all of that? It does it by retaining ownership of the land underneath the houses it sells. And by doing that, it can keep the sales prices of those homes low and also establish a maximum sales price that homeowners have to adhere to when they want to sell the home. So this maximum price ensures that the sellers selling the home gain some equity and gain some wealth in their home owning experience, and that the new sales price is affordable to the next buyers so that those buyers can afford home ownership as well. In Just Action, we described the Durham Land Trust in North Carolina. It was formed by a group of neighbors in a lower income, predominantly Black area of the city that started organizing to get the city to turn a vacant lot into a park because there was no safe place in their neighborhood for children to play. They succeeded, they won, they got the park, and this galvanized the group and helped them believe that they could achieve more. So they eventually formed a land trust to address the gentrification their neighborhood was experiencing. The land trust there started with 2 houses. They sold those 2 houses initially for $100,000 in today's dollars, far more affordable than houses were selling for in the neighborhood, and they still sell for pretty affordable prices. In Durham, on the blocks where the trust has been able to acquire and sell or rent homes, the residents are still mostly African American, while on other blocks in the area, Black residents have been mostly displaced and most of the residents are now white. So Durham's experience with this land trust shows us how effective trusts can be at preventing displacement and improving opportunity for residents of lower income segregated neighborhoods to stay in their neighborhoods as prices there start to rise. Durham Land Trust, their success has only been limited by their inability to buy more properties and to outpace investors that bought up properties in their neighborhood. So what do we do with this example? Well, we can support a land trust if there is one in our community, or help start one if there isn't. We can join or support a local campaign to press the banks, realtors, and developers in our communities who created segregation in the 20th century to make significant donations of money or land to local land trusts. These companies, the banks, realtors, and developers who created segregation, are often named on the original deeds of the homes with restrictive covenants, and sometimes the original companies still exist, or there are successor companies that took over, and those can be pressured to start contributing to remedying segregation by supporting a land trust in their community. So that's one example of a strategy that aims to improve resources in lower income segregated African American neighborhoods. The second category of policies we discuss include those that are concerned with opening up exclusive white neighborhoods to diverse residents through zoning reform, housing production, subsidies for African Americans to move into those areas. This category also includes policies and programs that protect the integration of diverse areas and challenge white flight from previously all-white neighborhoods as they start to diversify and threaten to resegregate. One important strategy for making exclusive neighborhoods inclusive involves Section 8 vouchers. For those unfamiliar with the program, Section 8 is a federal program and it's administered by local public housing authorities. The program provides vouchers to over 2 million low-income households who are disproportionately African American, and it helps them rent units on the private market. So unlike a public housing recipient whose benefit is tied to a place, their benefit is a unit that's owned by a housing authority, when a family receives a Section 8 voucher, they can use that voucher to rent anywhere in the housing authority's jurisdiction. So most of us, we want to live in areas with low crime, with well-resourced schools and open space, access to jobs, transportation, good retail stores. We call these areas of high opportunity. But most lower income families don't live in areas of high opportunity, in large part because those areas have been designed to keep them out by ensuring that they can't afford to live there. So Section 8 vouchers have the potential to address this by, in theory, allowing voucher holders to afford market rents, even in high opportunity areas. But only 5% of voucher holders around the country live in these high opportunity communities, and African American voucher holders are less likely to than whites. One reason for this is discrimination. Often landlords in more affluent areas refuse to rent to Section 8 recipients. This type of discrimination is allowed by the federal government, but some states, including Massachusetts, and many cities and localities, including Boston, have outlawed it with laws that are called source of income discrimination laws. Even in places like Boston, with a source of income discrimination law, discrimination still occurs. And that's because passing a law is only the first step. We need to educate, monitor, and enforce a law after it's passed, and that takes local civil rights groups and fair housing centers to do that work. So supporters of the redress of segregation can help ensure that those organizations, those civil rights groups, and fair housing centers have the resources they need to do this education, monitoring, and enforcement. Local activists can also volunteer with a fair housing organization and pose as a tester. And this is when a Black and a white applicant will go to apply for a rental unit, saying they have the same qualifications. Some might say they have Section 8 and some don't. And this can test whether landlords are discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders or by race. And the findings of these tests help us know where discrimination is occurring so that anti-discrimination laws can be enforced there. But fair housing centers need volunteers to do this testing work. So that's another way we can participate in redressing segregation. Another obstacle to voucher holders' mobility is the voucher amount itself. When a family receives a Section 8 voucher, it contributes 30% of its monthly income towards rent, and the voucher makes up the rest of the rent amount, up to a maximum amount. In most places, the maximum amount a voucher will support is set at slightly below the metropolitan area's median rent. So that means you take the entire metro area's span of rents, and you take the rent that's right in the middle, go a little bit below that, and that's the maximum amount a voucher will pay for a Section 8 family. Now that means that by definition, over half of the rents in a metro area are out of reach of voucher holders. Not surprisingly, these are the units that are in higher cost and higher opportunity areas. So even when landlords in those neighborhoods don't discriminate, voucher holders find it nearly impossible to find units in higher opportunity neighborhoods with rents that they can afford. So there was a lawsuit in Dallas in 2010 about this issue. It alleged that the voucher payment standard caused Black and Hispanic voucher holders segregation and isolation into high poverty communities. As a result of the lawsuit, housing authorities in the Dallas region adopted a new voucher payment standard. This one is based on median rents of smaller areas, a zip code or a group of zip codes, so that the maximum rent a voucher supports is higher in higher cost areas and lower in lower cost areas. Now, there are 180 housing authorities in 25 metro areas around the country that are required to use these smaller area rent standards. Boston is not one of them. But other areas that aren't required to, like Boston, can voluntarily adopt these smaller area rent standards. And local activists can support efforts to pressure their housing authorities to adopt them, to make it possible for voucher holding families to live in higher opportunity areas. Now, some jurisdictions have gone farther and adopted comprehensive mobility programs to help voucher holders move to these high opportunity neighborhoods. These programs usually have counselors who help participants look for and apply for units in these neighborhoods, help them navigate the application process, help them settle into neighborhoods they may be unfamiliar with. The programs also often have staff devoted to recruiting landlords in higher cost areas to rent to voucher holders. And the programs usually offer financial assistance to participants to help them with higher security deposits, rental application fees, and moving expenses. The programs are often run by housing organizations with the cooperation of local public housing authorities, and they usually have some foundation funding and sometimes a research component to study the program's outcomes. We've been following one of these programs in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There, like nationally, only 5% of voucher holders live in high opportunity neighborhoods. So the mobility program in Milwaukee has all of the funding it needs and all of the components I described, But voucher holders still find it difficult to find homes in low poverty neighborhoods because, first of all, discrimination against them is widespread, even though the city of Milwaukee has a source of income discrimination law. The suburbs do not. Also, the city's housing authority has opted to use small area rent standards, but only in a few zip codes in the city, but not all of them, and not in the suburban areas around Milwaukee. So it's hard for these participants in the program to find units they can afford. So this is an example of where an activated group concerned with the redress of segregation could have a real impact. The program in Milwaukee has all the resources it needs, but operates in a context that doesn't allow it to be successful. So local advocates could advocate for more anti-discrimination laws and enforcement of those laws, and could work with housing authorities to use the small area rent standard throughout the area. They could also help individually to recruit landlords in high opportunity areas to agree to rent to voucher holders. So that's an example of a strategy and some activities that a local group could take that would help open up exclusive white communities to more diverse residents. So before I take up too much time, I'll just add that these are two main categories we talk about, but there's also general strategies that cover both the goals of increasing investments in lower income communities and opening up exclusive white communities. These include increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in every neighborhood through down payment assistance programs and reforming the credit scoring system, which currently disadvantages African Americans. And I'll just conclude by saying that many people, if you start digging into these issues, you might see that many housing policymakers and advocates engage in this debate about whether we should focus on one of these types of strategies over the other. Some argue that we should focus our efforts on increasing resources in lower income segregated neighborhoods. Others argue we should focus our resources and our efforts on desegregating exclusive white neighborhoods. Well, we believe that we have so far to go and so much that needs changing before we make real progress on redressing segregation that we can't afford to be choosy. Any and all of these strategies will help us get there, and all will ultimately be necessary. We just need to get started. Right. So I hope that our book, Just Action, and my talk today gives us some ideas of how to do that. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, I learned, I really learned so much about what you're saying. I really enjoyed, the context, because see, a lot of the, the explicit nature, I think, is what I really take from what, you said. This is like for some, the myth. And I think, one of the things that I get from you especially is that the narrative, one of the things I found was that, talking to some of the people in the West End was that they were, they just stopped picking up the trash in the West End, and then it looked dirtier, and so this actions, this explicit intrusion into the communities to disrupt and things like that. I think that is very telling. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Okay, great. So what we're gonna do now is let me. Because my dear sister Inkaru is not here, so now I have to work it myself, and you see, it's not easy. So that's.
Marla, can you bring up my my tab with? There you go. Okay, so I'll. That was really amazing, and I think my favorite part of The Color of Law actually is the final chapter or epilogue, where your father, I think, gives a dozen or so proposals for addressing segregation, and so I'm excited to see this new work and see that expanded upon. That is, I think, the most innovative part of that book. So I'm gonna just kind of briefly talk about a little bit about the history of some of the programs we've been talking about, and particularly in the context of Boston. So what you're seeing there on the left of the screen is one of these infamous redlining maps from the 1930s that I learned, just turned 85 as of yesterday. These maps were made by the federal government, by a agency of the federal government called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. I think this is kind of echoing Leah. This is like one of the real important important conclusions you draw from these maps, and why they're important to look at is they do reveal in very explicit terms the government's endorsement and advancement of racial discrimination in the real estate market of the 20th century. This does, as she mentioned, become illegal with the Fair Housing Act in '68, but for much of the 20th century, this was not just de facto practice in the private real estate market, but was something that was again endorsed and advanced by the federal government. So you're looking at this map, and there's essentially what the Hulk did was they went out and tried to grade. They called these residential security maps. I'm going to zoom in here on this part of the map. And you see down here, there's the legend here lists these as a residential security map. And what they meant by security was security really for people that were going to be where to lend money in the mortgage marketplace of mid-century America. And what Hulk ultimately landed upon was a schema where they would assign areas, one of four grades, A, B, C, and D. A neighborhoods they described as best, and thought these areas were going to hold their value over the course of a mortgage. So a mortgage at the time, we think of a mortgage as like really of standard being a 30-year mortgage in the 21st century. Before Hulk and before the Great Depression, this really wasn't the norm. The norm was to have really short-term mortgages that had balloon payments, and partly because of Hulk, the federal government and its kind of rescue of homeowners during, and really of banks and savings loans during the Great Depression, introduced this longer-term mortgage, and it introduced a problem, which is both lenders and the federal government who's backing mortgages needs to have some kind of methodology for predicting whether these houses are going to maintain their values over the entirety of that mortgage term. So you just not thinking in the short term of a few years, 5 years. You need to think in terms of decades. Is this house that you're taking a risk on with a mortgage loan, is it going to hold its value? So that is a completely reasonable policy intervention by the federal government. The way that they do this becomes not just deeply problematic, but morally objectionable, because racism is really very much built into the way it assigns these grades. So back to the grades. They described these neighborhoods as best, and said, and that was essentially an assessment like this is going to hold its value over the course of a long-term mortgage, and thus for a lender who's making that decision, the federal government is saying, like, we've in the best of our ability as we investigate this and make predictions about the future, this area is going to hold its value, and this is a safe investment for you. On the other side, D, they describe these areas as hazardous. These are something that a responsible lending institution is going to deem to be too risky. The federal government says, like, we're not confident that this is a good investment for a mortgage lender. So our assessment as a government that, I mean, the Hulk and FHA have a complicated relationship with one another, but they're essentially saying the government, like, we deem these to be too risky, and the FHA, through its own method that's pretty similar to this, enforces that. It's also I'm making this a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. The grade is an indication that they are advising private lenders and government regulators are involved in that this is a risky investment. So, and then between them are Bs and Cs, which Bs being still desirable and Cs definitely declining was the kind of shorthand they used to describe these. And you can think about this like a traffic light for mortgage lenders. We've got 4 colors instead of 3, but we have the same sequence. We have at the top green, we have at the bottom red, and in the middle we have yellow. And you can think of these like a traffic light. So the green means go, but it's in this case it's not to proceed through a stoplight. It is to proceed with a loan. On the bottom, D, red, that like a stoplight means stop. Like this is not they're advising not to proceed with investments in a neighborhood. And then in the middle are these cases where they're, and particularly with the 3rd grade, the yellow lined areas, they're saying like you might want to proceed, you might not want to, you might want to stop, but in either case you want to exercise more caution before as you're making these decisions. Okay, so let me show you, like, immediate question becomes like if these are kind of a reasonable policy intervention by the government, how are they making these grades? And I'm going to show you one of these scans, which is a survey instrument that they had. They work with bankers, lenders, to fill out what they called an area description, and it's meant to describe an area and get at some some physical features of the area. What type of buildings are there? Some financial aspects of the real estate market there. What's the sales demand? What's the rental demand? Where it becomes deeply problematic is in the section 2 here, which is inhabitants, because they didn't not just want to know about the housing. They didn't want to just know about the amenities and the access to infrastructure. They wanted to know about the people that live there. And another term that Leah mentioned in connection with FHA handbook was infiltration. And they wanted to know explicitly about the infiltration in any given neighborhood. And what they meant by infiltration was the presence of anyone really who wasn't like native-born white American. So in particular, there's this line here, 2D, which they wanted to know about the presence of African Americans in a neighborhood, and then 2C of foreign-born families of immigrants in a neighborhood. In this case, I'm highlighting the area description for Roxbury, essentially. And in this case, they one of the reasons that this is assigned to D grade is that 50% of the residents of this neighborhood are foreign-born immigrants from various countries, and 25% of the population is African American, and because of the infiltration of the foreign-born and of African Americans, that is in and of itself enough for them to have deemed this to be an unwarranted risk for lending into these neighborhoods. So let me close this out. Yeah, so I'll cut to the chase. So let me show the map again. The areas in Boston that are redlined, and actually change the view here a little bit, are the South End and Roxbury. So the area that had the highest concentration of African Americans, which isn't huge in the 1930s, by the way. So Boston was never a major destination for the Great Migration. Unlike Chicago, New York, Cleveland received huge influxes of African Americans. I believe in the 1930s, about 2% of the population of Boston was African American, or 2% was Asian American. It's overwhelmingly white. It's like 95, 96%, I think. But that's Boston and Cambridge together. But these small populations were heavily segregated in the South End, Roxbury, And these are the areas, not alone, but the biggest areas in Boston proper that were redlined. Other areas that were redlined, Marlon was referring to this. There are areas that had the foreign-born, so Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, French-Canadian neighborhoods. Those are also redlined. So Boston is not unusual in this, and these documents, this body of evidence from the 1930s. Boston is typical in this, and it's in kind of giving us a window into the racism of government housing policy, into the nativism of government policy, and giving us a window into the anti-Semitism of this policy in the 1930s.
Right.
Now, I want to jump forward to just really briefly talk about urban renewal. Let me jump to a different project.
I don't know this project, Mr. Dr. Dan Nelson. There's another one.
Yeah. So we have this is kind of a companion to mapping equality. And by the way, if you just Google mapping inequality, you'll be able to explore these.
Right. And it's on my link tree. You guys go to www.linktree.afrimerican1. On our link tree, you'll see that we have a link to Dr. Nelson's maps.
So this is I'll be even briefer here because we did see that great video about urban renewal in the 1950s and 1960s, and this is a project that we did that maps urban renewal projects across the country. There's about 200 cities that have these redlining maps. There's 600 cities or so, and we don't even list them as say cities. 600 municipalities. They're cities, towns, villages, some counties. They're often quite small that received money from the federal government for urban renewal projects that start off as a slum clearance project. It's a very expansive program over the course of its 25 years and grew. But what these programs have in common is that the brunt of them often fell upon communities of color. So Boston, again, like no exception. It's pretty typical of this program and its just kind of broad outlines. Not every urban renewal project resulted in displacements. Many didn't. But in Boston, those that did often came at the cost or fell most heavily upon African American and communities and communities of color. So Boston's like one big urban renewal project, but a couple that had really pronounced numbers of displacements were South Cove and the South End. So South Cove displaced. These are numbers that reported to the federal government, and they're probably there's reason to think that they're underestimates of what actually happened. So there's 133 families displaced, about 50-50. Families of color and white families, but off of those white families, as Marlon mentioned, would be say immigrant families, Italian. So kind of fell heavily. That white covers up and disguises the fact that this often falls upon ethnic communities. South End, about 50-52. So that doesn't sound too bad, but the fact is that the percentage of residents of color in Boston was not that high. So in the 1960s, it was about 10%. By 1970, it's almost 20%. So if you live in Boston, you're African American in the 1960s, you're like 5 times more likely to be displaced than a white family. The majority of, again, like put this another way. Well, I'll show you another way of looking at this really quickly. So this is a cartogram of displacements of families by urban renewal projects in the course of the 25 years of this program. The size of the bubbles, each bubble represents a municipality that received federal funds for an urban renewal projects. And the size of the bubbles are proportional to the number of families that are displaced by those projects. And then the color is a gradient, where the more purple it is, the more these are families of color that are displaced, and the greener it is, they are more white families. And Boston looks, in this case, like kind of green, right? It's the majority
high
of
cultural
it.
diversity.
And they just got compared to some of these cities at a lower percentage of African Americans as residents. So it doesn't, like, you might look at this and like come to the conclusion that, you know, in the South they concentrated on displacing African Americans, and the North it's more somehow egalitarian or something like that, or fairer, because it doesn't. It's greener, and this falls more heavily upon white Americans, but that's not remotely the case. So This is a chart showing the same data, and it looks a little funky, but it's really actually pretty simple to read. So the on the, I guess let's call it the y-axis, is the percentage of the cities that were white. So that background, if the city's in that kind of green area, that means it was overwhelmingly white. So on the bottom right, if it's on the top left, which no cities are, that means it was overwhelmingly its residents were of color. And so you draw a line across that. And so any city that falls below that line meant that relative to its overall population, it disproportionately displaced families of color. And so Boston, I believe, is right there, right? So it's, you know, again, I already said this, right? It's a 90% of the population of Boston in 1960 was white, but 70% of it's less than 70% of it, the displacements from urban renewal were white. So you're much, even though like 2/3 of the displacements in Boston were of white families, families of color were substantially overrepresented in the displacements relative to their percentage in the overall population. Okay. And then finally, last thing I want to mention is why does this matter? Like, this is the past. This is illegal now. But the facts of this linger to this day. And so this is just one real quick example I will show you of, and Marlon alluded to this too, Massachusetts. Let's go to Boston. There it is. So this is a project we did with two outside partners. One is the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which does some really great advocacy around housing issues and fair housing, affordable housing. And another is an epidemiologist at the University of Michigan named Helen Meyer. And this was at the outset of the pandemic, and we knew early on in the pandemic that the impact of this in terms of deaths, illness, was falling more heavily upon communities of color. And so partly we wanted to kind of look at the relationship between redlining, 20th century systemic racism in the real estate market, and health, morbidity, and mortality in American neighborhoods. And so what you see on the left is that redlining map of Boston that we've already discussed, and what is a map of census tracts where the pinker it is, the higher its social vulnerability. It's a CDC measure of social vulnerability index, and it just basically means, like, how resilient is this community? How many resources does it have to weather some kind of disaster, like, say, a pandemic? And then the greener means that these have low social vulnerability. And you see a relationship that's a spatial relationship that's pretty straightforward here, where neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s tend to have high social vulnerability. So what does that even really mean? And we'll be really quick about this. So let's go back to Roxbury. So it's a very high social vulnerability index of 0.9 on a scale of between 0 and 1. It's today, this is the percentages from today, it's 80% community of color, and it's life expectancy. Look how far down that is. So this is the distribution of life expectancies. It's 77 years. And the reason that is because it has, as well, high poverty, but its incidences of disease incidences are super high. So it's high in asthma relative to other areas of the city, diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney disease, all at the top, mental health challenges, obesity, pulmonary disease. And we'll compare this to one of the green lined areas, which I believe is called, it's part of Jamaica Plains. And it's Jamaica Hills, I believe.
Right.
And it has a lower social SVI score, 0.25, and just scanning through here, it's kind of got far lower incidences of all these health issues. And so, this is something we definitely need to understand better. And the reason we need to understand this, the kind of causal relationship, because it's too simple to say redlining causes. There's 80 years of history in there, and there's a lot of phenomena, urban renewal, and a whole host of policies, part of which Leah was talking about. But we, and kind of amplify a point that Leah was making, I'm working with the Saints Partners now on an NIH grant to understand the relationship between redlining, siting of industrial sites, and health disparities along lines of race. And we need to understand this so we can have anti-racist policies that address these problems, that tackle inequality in the 21st century by redressing thoughtfully the impact of 20th century policies that continue to affect us today. And so with that, I will stop.
Oh no, thank you so much. Oh my God, like I'm over here like this, all the data points are I'm writing. No, Dr. Nelson, I think okay, can you show that map again? The last one you showed? Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed, what this proves is what I see, redline sprawl. So in the lower half of this, your picture, that's where the Haitian, Jamaican, and everybody else that joined the original African Americans sprawled down Blue Hill Ave and it stops right here at the red line border to Milton, and it stops right here at Brookline. See, so this is an incomplete map. See, this area here is the richest. It was the area that is cordoned off by the people who, like I call them, the 1776ers. So that area is like full of the people who have been affluent for many, many years. So it has the most T stops in Boston, right? Even though it's not part of quote unquote Boston. And this Milton area, the same thing. This is this is where the John Quincy Adams people live, right? So that that's there. Also, that red part that you're talking about is my students found out is the most dense part of Boston. So the area you're talking about is actually probably the most highly populated, and that's the Jewish area that was emptied during the where all the temples are. So this data is extremely helpful, and especially the part about the social vulnerability. I also wanted to also say that one of the things that even though it's highly white, right? What I saw from that data was, even though yes, you're right, it's highly white, because of it's a multicultural. That green kind of symbolizes multiculturalism, because yes, it means that there were a lot of 1776ers in the environment. That's why it was highly white. However, they were not considered Americans, per se. One of the effects was that the Jewish even community, there were people that changed their names. So they changed their names in Europe, escaping. Then when they got here, because of all this, racial thing, some Jewish people also changed their names again, right? So this, I just want to make sure that we are looking at it, a little bit as a, because I don't even believe doing good things with race is even like ultimately, what we're looking to achieve. We want to look at it where the content of our character is the main focus. And we had the Irish people that were also redlined, and remember, these Irish people gave us John F. Kennedy, right? Who was the person who wanted to really push the civil rights. So that cultural diversity, even in the presidency, was broken by, I guess one of these residents that were redlining. So I don't think it's right to dehumanize any human being. So I just, I always want to make sure that we're very clear. But no, thank you so much for these words. And I was taking notes. So we have our things. We're going on an hour and 30 minutes. So I know I want to get to the end. So what we'll do, since I think we are running over time. Really, we're supposed to start our quiz, but I'm going to let that go because I don't know if we have that many people online at this point. We have 8 people, and only 2 people signed up for a Slido, so I'm going to let it go at that. But I want to talk about some of the actions we're doing here in Boston and what my organization has been doing, especially from the cultural diversity point of view. We have 4 projects that we're doing for the Boston Redline 85, which is, like I said, to mark the 85 anniversary of the Boston Redline map. And this basically this covers a little bit of how we want to go, but our academy basically is designed to provide the cultural supports that the urban renewal, because what we kind of focused on is that these communities don't know are disorientated because they were displaced, right? And if you're not treating this as like a displacement refugee, if you take 60% of any community and wipe it out, right? Especially, like I said, when you're talking about people who were just 100 years prior, enslaved. So they don't have like 1,000 years of Italian, or Jewish culture that is so strong, right? The Native Americans, they were culturally, they had cultural removal done to them as well, right? But they were on their land. So despite that, whatever happened, I'm not saying it wasn't terrible. I'm saying that they had their land that you can't take that away from them, right? Because they're still here, right? So the African Americans' position without the land is why, like I said, like we have so low amount of musical skills in our community because we were, so this a little more vital, a little more biting, a little more permanent because they had vibrant communities that were homeowners. And you had all these other things prior to the 60s. So these projects are meant to get people out of their silos, right? Because who doesn't love music, right? It's meant to get people out of their silos. Who doesn't love Bill Russell? And then, of course, this cultural diversity program. So these are just a little bit. So then I'll just give a little bit of synopsis. That project 1 is our data crunching, where we go over Dr. Nelson's maps, and now he has given us some new resources to keep us busy for a long time. But this is where we do a lot of the number crunching, looking at maps, and this is basically with a partnership with Northeastern, in which they give me grad students, engineering management grad students, and we do the number crunching on this. Now, the other ones are kind of like where our students, like I said, there are 2 histories here, right? And one of the things is to get people galvanized. In organizing, I don't believe you can do anything to make people come together. I believe you can show them cultural things that bring them together, right? These, so Bill Russell was here, and one of the things about the segregation is that even the definitions are segregated. I don't know if you saw the mermaid, the controversy over the mermaid, where, just a picture of a Black Ariel, even though she was in the Caribbean with Sebastian, right? Even though that was something like the segregation has now taken on a mental thing where even just being exposed to multiculturalism causes issues. So he is a basketball player. He's not a civil rights leader, but he was a very big civil rights leader, leading a lot of civil rights things in our community in that area that you were talking about while his community was being bulldozed. So we talk about his history and what he did so we can inspire the youth. In fact, the Office of Black Male Advancement is sponsoring this program because, we want to let kids know you can be a gentle giant and make a big difference. We have the Umoja Unity Ahud. I think I said that right. And it's Ahud means oneness in Hebrew. And the idea is that we're going to get young people to discuss and find pathways, because like I said, we have these churches that are now kind of being shared culturally because they're still been built by the first early Jewish settlers, to Boston. So that's something that we're trying to give exposure to, and yellow lining because of the multicultural nature of it. And then finally, we have Redline Music, which is meant to kind of promote, like I said, this one of the spaces in that church was a choir, right? So people used to practice their culture and how to play instruments in a safe space. And because of the lack of that, we don't have as much music players, right? And in fact, one of the great things that they did was they used the cultural artifacts that they got from their ancestors to create rap, because they sampled a lot of those old tunes, right? But they couldn't play the instruments, but they still found a way to use it to be creative, because the mind is still working. So we want, to promote that. So these are some of the projects that our students do in order to we're not gonna do this right now, because I think we went a little over, but it's fine. But the idea is that we definitely understand that we have a community that that was devastated to the point where now we're disorientated. And I think we're going to need supports to get back on the track that we were prior to the, because urban renewal was, remember, these people are just, like you said, they just migrated, they just escaped from the South. So they were, and another thing I heard is like a lot of people from Boston also came from Chicago. So maybe if Chicago was like a first point of call, but is there data to say where that, did they continue to move on from another place, right? And go to another location? Because in this community that you were talking about, the African-American community was actually quite small, but also very integrated into the community, because they had been here since 1770, whatever. Right, because this is like, this is the Harriet Tubmans, the Frederick Douglasses. That group had been here. Their church moved from Beacon Hill to the 12th Street Baptist Church, which is in the Redline South End, right? So that community was now joined by a bunch of Southerners and people from all over the country, right? So now you had this great diversity of like Louisiana cooking, Alabama, like it was just a plethora of different, so once these people were not able to have the safe spaces, that dispersal at that very time, I think when you put things in context, you have to realize that we won the right to vote in the 60s. By the time it was time to vote, there was physically nobody in the place to vote. That is, you have to, if you don't look at it from that perspective, you don't understand we're rebuilding. We're not starting from slavery. We're literally rebuilding from the 60s. So just when we was actually really urban renewal for real for us, because we had just moved. So that dispersal at that very time, and then you now say, well, okay, now it's time for us to vote, but there's physically nobody in that district. Then you now start seeing, when you now start overlaying what happened afterwards, like the family programs that kept Black males away from their family. This was all happening afterwards, right? Or even the Kernan report is like, why are they rioting? What do you mean, why are they rioting? You just displaced like 60% of Boston's Black community. Of course they're rioting. They have no place to live. You know what I'm saying? Like all these things with the cultural bit, with the civil rights, if you overlay it with the infrastructure part, it really does call for greater cultural protections on these communities, because you cannot say, because of our unique situation, you cannot say, oh, well, Italians, well, yeah, but Italians been doing that since Rome. Like these communities recently had just constituted enough strength to be able to fight for civil rights. At the same time, when they were fighting for civil rights, these churches were being investigated by COINTELPRO and other government agencies. So it wasn't just the infrastructure agency. It was multiple arms of the government, right, that were on this, like the welfare and then the policy. Now you're arresting people that just got displaced 15 years ago in the 80s for crack. There was no way you could make the correlation, right? And then all these things go on and on, gang violence, where the policing is done, removal of the moral fiber, which was the church, The leader of that church was Martin Luther King. He was a reverend, you know. So these kind of cultural, I think that for people that invented Kwanzaa during the 60s, right? You're thinking of cultural identity issues with like the Nation of Islam with Muhammad Ali, Quran. Cultural development and who we are as a people is always the thing, right? Oh, we don't know where we're from, Africa. No, it really matters. And when they were developing this culture over the 100 years between 1865 and 1965, like I said, with all the music and all the other things, the history that goes on behind that, that's why we're doing this for Black History Month, because I feel like the technical information, which is the civil rights information, it's perfect, right? And it's needed. But without the Green Book overlay with what was going on culturally at that time, it's almost like you want to say, you know, if you, if I tell somebody to, kiss my butt, right? If I tell a 3-year-old kiss my butt and I tell a 25-year-old kiss my butt, those are two different definitions, right? One is child abuse and the other is, hey man, I kiss my butt, it could be a joke, right? But so the level of cultural development, the level of growth that we had achieved in the 60s, I just feel like that's the Black history that needs to be kind of told. And that's why this work that I do is important. That's why the work that you guys do is important. That's why we want to thank you for coming with your wealth of knowledge, your understanding of the issues, especially from two different perspectives. I thought it was awesome because I thought, the policy with Leah and Dr. Nelson, your technical, you got me going over here. I didn't even know some of those things. And then with the cultural diversity because my community does not know this. Okay? Even now, there are not many Black engineers. And even the Black engineers would have had to go through the very system to become an engineer that would have now kind of whitewashed their viewpoints to not really see things in the way that, of how to solve them. Right? De-engineering, being able to see the community and then, being able to see the community and de-engineer what is there to say what was there, right? Because we had achieved things. So I don't think we're asking for people to just give us opportunities to get better. I think the real question is, are you going to be able to try to create what was missing? What we had achieved. Right. And I think that is the conversation that we want to start moving forward is we had already achieved things. It's not like we hadn't. The Green Book is a great, I'm telling you, you should get one, Dr. Nelson. You see all the kinds of businesses that went on in these locations, right? Because these were the safe places that people of color had to travel to, right? Right. These are the cultural ramifications of urban renewal. And we just thank you guys for being here. So, I don't know if Leah left. Mila probably had to leave, right? But Dr. Nelson, please, any parting words, and we'll wrap this bad boy up.
No, just thanks for the invitation to be here.
Thank you so
and
much.
Good luck with the rest of your programming.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to reach out to you about those other things because you got my brain popping right now. So thank you so much once again. And thank you for everybody who stayed on YouTube. Thanks to City of Boston Office of Equity and Opportunity and Inclusion. Also, thank you to the Black Male Advancement Office. Thank you to the Roxbury Innovation Center for sponsoring our events and everybody out there who has been supporting. We have 14 more events. Go to our website, check everything out, and have a great rest of your weekend. All right.